Hello, everybody. I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes, and welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. And we're starting with this book cover here that you can see, because while I have no particular interest in the physics of vibrations and waves, somebody clearly does. This H.J. Payne person who wrote it probably does, because I can't imagine that he or she would have written it if they didn't. Which brings me to an idea I want to throw out there for consideration. We've all been to school and been handed some textbook by a teacher that was just terrible. You know, you read through it and the subject is dull and the writing is dull and everything in it is the worst, and you hate the textbook. We all have textbooks that we hate because they're textbooks. They're not really designed to entertain, they're designed to inform. But here's the interesting thing about textbooks, and that is that as much as you or I or any number of people might find physics of vibrations and waves just the most dull thing we've ever heard, for somebody who's interested in physics and vibrations and waves, who's interested in how sound travels or in how waves work in the ocean or any of that stuff that is based off of fundamentals that come out of vibrations and how that affects things that can form waves. Which, let's be honest, yes, even the Earth can form waves, but most of us can't see it because it's either too subtle or we're too busy screaming in terror from an earthquake. Um, but there are things that actually, have waves. The thing is, if you're interested in it, then the textbook may well be interesting. And that's the thing about textbooks is there is a tiny number of textbooks out there that will be interesting in and of themselves because they're just so well written that you'd actually enjoy them. But that's a really tiny number. More often, you can find textbooks that are interesting because you're interested in the topic. And I bring this up because today's book is a textbook from my second year in university. I was taking a course on medieval architecture, and this was the first of the two textbooks in the course. I will get to the second textbook at some point, but I wanted to start with this one because it actually has color pictures, whereas the other one has no color pictures except for its cover, which is kind of sad, actually, because um, stained glass is interesting and stuff, and there's some talk about it, and there's pictures in black and white, and it's weird. But that's neither here nor there. Roger Stalley's Early Medieval Architecture is an interesting book if you're interested in medieval architecture. If you're not interested in architraves, if you're not interested in arches, if you're not interested in the decorations and phrases like arched corbel tables, which I will freely admit is about the only thing that I took away from my medieval architecture course, is the phrase arched corbel table. Which, if you're curious, a corbel is a thing that you stick underneath something to make it look like it's sort of holding stuff up. And a table in this case is not a stuff that you put your teacup on, it's a thing that sort of goes higher up that is a broad, long thing that looks like stuff is resting on it. And a corbel table is, well, corbelling as in table form, and then an arched corbel table is a corbel table with arches. It's actually oddly self-explanatory once you know what tabling and corbelling are. That probably made absolutely no sense, which is why if you're really interested, you should probably find yourself a textbook. Um, so, there's a couple of reasons I'm talking about this book. First of all, because it's really, really interesting. Um, this is one of the few art kind of textbooks that honestly doesn't have a lot of genuine history in it. There is history in it because you can't talk about art and architecture of the past without some discussion of history. but there's actually much less than I usually have a preference for. I normally very much enjoy reading how the art and history interacted with each other, and this tends to lean much more on purely what the architecture was visually and about and how it came to be in certain practical terms. I have not put any of these pictures in any particular order. They're kind of in the order they appear in the book, and I will give you references in the description stuff below, along with the usual, you know, author and publication information. But this picture here, which is as you can see, not an actual photograph, but this is Old St. Peter's in Rome. That is a drawing circa 1620 of St. Peter's as it was before rebuilding, as it was before the roof, because you can see up top, that's a timber roof. If you look up here, if you can even see my mouse thing, that's a timber roof. That's the Vatican Basilica before all of the building and rebuilding that happened during the 17th century. And the thing is that this is the source, one of the kinds of sources that people studying medieval architecture have to rely on, because so many buildings from the medieval period were burned down, fell down, were raised, raised as in R-A-Z-E-D, or if you're going to be American about it, R-A-Z-E-D, razed to the ground, and a lot of them were also taken apart for spare parts for other buildings. And what that basically added up to, aside from the very entertaining fact that a lot of these older medieval buildings had actually been were from older Roman buildings that had been taken apart for spare parts. But what it means is that sometimes there's very little left, and they have to make guesswork. They have to look at pictures like this and stitch together what it had to have looked like in reality, in fact. You have things like this, which is a picture of Sant'Apollinaire in Ravenna from 549. And you look at something like this, which, by the way, look at those arches. Look at how in each arch there's like a different set of design things. See, there's little circle things in the middle, and there's diamond things, and there's square things, and then there's circle things, and these marble columns. This is a simple, relatively straightforward basilican church. You can see that this is a 2-page spread that's slightly off kilter because I had to use Microsoft Paint to stitch this together, so yeah, it is what it is. But again, there's a timber roof. This is an old church, and what they lack in the architectural complexity of later basilicas, they more than make up for in the medieval tradition of having large amounts of paint everywhere. Because, of course, in the medieval period, like in ancient Roman Greece, actually, all of this stuff that today is bare stone was once covered in paint, and they had, you know, everything was painted and brightly colored, and it's actually a very weird aesthetic because, of course, we get used to seeing all this stuff as bare stone and thinking of the bare stone as the aesthetic, but actually massive amounts of frescoes were part of these things. And here's another sample of the kind of reference, and a much more difficult to parse reference, that this is an engraving from 1612 of based on a lost drawing of the 11th century, which is a picture of Saint-Riquier, also known as Centula, in the Somme, which they have to figure out from this what the actual church and monastery looked like. And think about that. Think about this very medieval drawing. It's got no sense of perspective the way we would consider it, the way we would think about things normally. It doesn't have that way that we in the West learned how to do perspective during the Renaissance. This is that medieval way of drawing things, and in a lot of ways it's kind of cubist, where you're seeing all the angles of stuff, even though we wouldn't necessarily from this weird high up angle be able to see any of these things. Which is helpful in terms of knowing where the corbelling is and what the tops and capitals of the columns are. It's a lot more trouble if you're trying to, get an idea of what it physically, actually, practically looked like. And here's the picture that I kind of really wanted to do this book for, because this picture is sort of a centerpiece to this whole book. This picture is a picture of San Vitale in Ravenna, and this is a relatively small, all things considered, non-basilican church. And it's very Roman, you can tell, because you can see up here where I'm circling an extremely Renaissance-y picture up there. But look at how the interaction between this cupola bit here and the arches and the way that goes in and out, that the architecture interacts with the mosaic and with the fresco. It interacts with them to create this really dizzying, complex view of the architecture. And right after this, thank you, computer, for pretending that you're a tablet again. I really, really appreciate you ruining my video. After this, we have a picture of Aachen, which is this is basically a ripoff of San Vitale in Ravenna. This was done by Charlemagne, who is that is the guy who was in charge during the Carolingian period of European history. And Charlemagne, or Charlemagne, as we Anglophones tend to call him, was attempting to sort of revive the glory of Rome, and so he does this, and you can see, if you compare the two, that he's trying to copy that double arching, the two columns, but they haven't quite figured it out, and so it's simplified. It's like a simplified copy. And copying was something that they did a lot during the Romanesque period, during the Carolingian period of architecture, is they did a lot of copying of other things, copying of church styles, copying of previous churches in an attempt to evoke the holiness of those churches. There's a chapter in this book on the architecture of castles, and that is, of course, a castle. That is Castle Rising in Norfolk, circa 1140. And he makes a very, very solid and interesting point about castles and how we tend to think of churches as being decorative and castles as just being forts. But look over here. Look down in the middle, in the bottom. I'm circling it with my mouse, if you can see that at all. Look at those arches. That's decoration. That's architectural decoration, not anything with any practical value. And it's really kind of pretty. And pretty was something that was very important to all of these noblemen. They wanted their castles to not just be impregnable fortresses, they wanted them to look good. And he talks about monastic orders and how they affected architecture, because they did. And I just wanted to show you this picture of Santiago de Compostela because these are also gorgeous, and I am out of time. Durham Cathedral, thank you for coming.